Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Khalid Al-Gindi, and I'm Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs here at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our second part in a two-part series looking at the future of Palestinian politics, particularly in light of a new incoming U.S. administration. Few words just by way of context. As I think is pretty clear to everyone, Palestinian politics have been in a state of paralysis and decline for many years. The problems are well known: political division, internal institutional decline, both in the Palestinian Authority and in the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, chronic financial problems, growing authoritarianism and corruption, both in the Palestinian Authority leadership in Ramallah and the parallel Hamas Authority in Gaza. All of these highlight a deeper crisis of legitimacy, as well as what many see as a lack of strategic vision by either the PA or Hamas. All of this is happening in an especially hostile local, regional, and international environment. Israeli occupation is becoming more entrenched, Israeli settlements, and the settlement project has been hugely successful. All the more so under the Trump administration. Arab regimes, meanwhile, have deprioritized the Palestinian issue, and some might even say have abandoned the Palestinians almost entirely, as many now seek to normalize relations with Israel outside of developments on the Palestinian track. The election of Joe Biden, while certainly not a panacea for Palestinians, promises at least some relief from what many see as an unrelenting assault on Palestinian rights and their political aspirations. One of the key themes that emerged in part one is that this the internal Palestinian dysfunction is intimately bound up in this question of a national strategy or a lack thereof. In today's session, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this very question. What is or should be the Palestinian national strategy, both in terms of the vision of what an endgame would look like, one state versus two states versus some sort of hybrid scenario, and how to go about achieving it. Negotiations and diplomacy, the BDS movement, other civil society initiative, armed struggle, of course, also has played a part in Palestinian history, nonviolent resistance as well. To help us better understand these issues, I'm pleased to welcome a really excellent panel of experts. You have their longer bios on their webpage, but I'll introduce them here quickly. First, we have Dana Al-Kurd. Dana is a researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies and an assistant professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Her recent book, Polarized and Demobilized: Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine, published by Oxford University Press, is now out. We also have with us Mariam Barghouti joining us from Ramallah. Mariam is a Palestinian writer and researcher based in Ramallah. She received a BA from Birzeit University in English Literature and Language and a Master's of Science from the University of Edinburgh in Sociology and Global Change. She's written extensively on socio-political developments in the Middle East with a focus on the Levant. Last and certainly not least, we are very pleased to have Yousef Munayir. Yousef is a Palestinian-American writer and political analyst based here in Washington. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute with us here at the Palestine program, as well as a senior non-resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington. He was formerly executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, as well as the Jerusalem Fund. In terms of format, I'll begin with a couple rounds of questions for our panelists, after which we'll take some audience questions. Those in the audience, if you'd like to submit questions, please do so using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. For those calling in by phone or watching the panel on live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please use that same email, events@mei.edu. edu. Feel free to pose a question at any time during the discussion, and we'll be checking the questions periodically, and we'll try to work them in to the conversation as we go. So let's go ahead and get started. Just by way of framing, the way I look at the issue, sort of from a big picture view, it seems like there are three separate national programs being pursued simultaneously. On the one hand, you have the PA and the PLO pursuing negotiations and diplomacy, ideally, in their view, under U.S. sponsorship, along with things like security and other types of cooperation with Israel, as we saw the announcement to renew those ties just a few days ago. Then we have another program represented by Hamas, in which there is some selective armed resistance, either directly or by tolerating it, combined with a desire to show responsible governance as a governing force in the Gaza Strip. The third program that we've seen is sort of at the civil society level. You have the BDS movement and these mostly ad hoc mobilizations that we've seen on again, off again in places like Gaza and Jerusalem. So the question in my mind is, and I think just to sort of frame the discussion going forward, is which of these or other elements should be part of a Palestinian national strategy going forward, and how can Palestinians go about achieving them? So my first question I'm going to put to Dana. So this week, the PA leadership announced that it was resuming ties with Israel, including security coordination, as well as sending its representatives, its ambassadors back to the UAE and Bahrain after they had been recalled following the normalization deals. We've also seen reports that the leadership is planning to reform the prisoner martyr payments that had been such a sore point for American politicians, particularly the US Congress. All of these are seen as kind of gestures to the incoming Biden administration, but we also can't ignore the context in which they're happening. We have certainly Pompeo's visit to Israeli settlements and the new policies that are designed to legitimize Israeli settlements, as well as new major settlement plans in and around Jerusalem that have been announced by the Israeli government. So what is your assessment of the PA's current thinking in taking these decisions? And what does it tell us about the leadership's strategy going forward?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question and for having me today. So in terms of, the recent steps that the PA has taken, whether it's security coordination, the ambassadors to the Bahrain and the UAE, all of these different moves that are intended, like you said, for the Biden administration and international audience, it's really just a very good indication of just how far the Palestinian Authority is from the objective of representing the Palestinian people and working on their behalf. So, all of these moves are a signal of their desire to return to the Oslo framework, to return to the status quo that was slightly upended by the Trump administration, in spite of how dramatically it has failed to produce Palestinian self-determination or preserve Palestinian dignity. Especially, I would say, on the question of security coordination, some scholars and activists have likened the Palestinian Authority's role to being a subcontractor of repression, and it's highly unpopular amongst Palestinians, according to polling, for the Palestinian Authority to coordinate with Israeli occupation to the degree that it has, and it's often on policing the Palestinian people and politically repressing them. And this just shows how little the Palestinian Authority is taking into consideration the calls for reform and the calls to rethink the Oslo framework entirely, and how little they actually are held accountable through mechanisms of democratic accountability to their own society. And I think this reflects the overall trajectory of the Palestinian Authority, how it's increasingly become divorced from accountability. And I argue that this is a direct impact of the types of international intervention and pressure that have kind of characterized the Palestinian Authority and its development since its creation. So how they've reacted to regional shifts, the Trump administration's pressure, and their own sidelining within their cause has been a culmination of this overall trend that we've seen with the Palestinian Authority over time, often empowered, like I said, by the international community. And while I understand that, cutting off security coordination has logistic implications, which affects Palestinians and their livelihoods and access and all these things. For instance, we saw the patients seeking medical care denied entry and babies kept unregistered as a result of the cutting off of coordination. But the price of continuing the status quo is much more detrimental, and I think will have terrible implications for the ability of Palestinians to remain on their land and remain steadfast and achieve some form of self-determination at some point. And in terms of the ambassadors, as we were saying earlier, this is a complete abdication of leadership. Arab citizens are looking to remain committed to the Palestinian cause. All the polling suggests that they are committed to the Palestinian cause, and especially in the Gulf, people are taking extraordinary risks to show their commitment to Palestine in light of the normalization deals that have happened. And Palestinian leadership completely deflates those efforts with this type of action because it, muddies the water of what we should expect from regional allies. Excuse me.
Thank you, Dana. So turning to Yusuf, obviously, if you want to address the same issue about the leadership strategy or lack of a strategy, but I wanted to press you also on an issue that I know is near and dear to your heart and you've written about extensively. Just looking at the situation now, it's very hard to argue for that a two-state solution is even viable. And you've written obviously extensively on the need to drop the two-state solution and work for one state with equal rights. My question to you is, I think a lot of people would agree, especially when you have a U.S. administration that is legitimizing settlements, how can we even talk about a two-state solution? But the question is, can you achieve a one-state solution without a credible political actor? As of this moment, there is no single Palestinian or Israeli political actor anywhere that is advocating or sort of mobilizing under the banner of one state. And so can something like that be entirely driven by civil society, or do you need also kind of a political critical mass to achieve that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Khaled. Before I get into that, I just want to first thank you for putting this panel together. I know this is part of a series as well with another panel. And I wanted to thank you in particular for bringing together an important collection of Palestinian voices, which I think represent a generation of Palestinians that fills me in particular with great optimism about the Palestinian future, that represent the best of what Palestine has to offer to the world. And it's an honor to be speaking alongside many of them regularly and speaking about Palestine in this seminar and others. And I believe that this generation will prove to those regimes who have chosen to normalize with apartheid that the bet that they have made against the Palestinian future was a very bad one indeed. On the question of moving forward with one state vision and how that can work and so on, you're right, this is something I've written extensively about along with many others. And I think the obvious conclusion is that two states is not working. I think anyone with any objective analysis can tell you that is the case. But I would push back on the idea that the two-state vision has some sort of real political mobilization behind it. I think this is something of a caricature that doesn't really bear out when one looks at the evidence, particularly among Palestinians. When you look at what their desires are, what their key concerns are, what are the issues that are most important to them, consistently the public opinion polling shows that their vision of an end to occupation, a right of return for Palestinian refugees, and so on, is not compatible with the conventional two-state solution that is often parroted around as something that has, political mobilization behind it. So I will concede to you that there is plenty of work to be done to build that behind a one-state vision. But I also think we are overselling it to say that such mobilization exists behind a two-state vision as well. All that being said, when it comes to moving forward with a one-state program, I believe it'll be fundamentally easier, even if far off from trying to create partition for the obvious reasons that exist on the ground, the physical obstacles to that, the political obstacles to that, but also because the vision of equal rights within a single state will be a vision, is a vision that will be easier to build political coalitions and alliances around, both in the region, among people, and internationally within global civil society, and with some of the very important political spaces where change is necessary, including here in the United States, for there to be change on the ground in Israel-Palestine. Look, the reality is the average American doesn't care where you draw a line between Kiryat this and Khirbet that. It's just not something that motivates people. What people do care about is, and what people are motivated by, are questions of freedom, equality, dignity, civil rights. This is something that resonates here, and we can build with that, and we see progress with that. And I think, the single most important component that is missing, and actually the conditions are far more favorable now than many realize, is a leadership that fully embraces and is willing to take the step towards moving this vision forward in conditions that are more favorable, I think, today than ever, regardless to what, whatever wine tasting experiments are being conducted by the current Secretary of State in an Israeli settlement today. The future is one that I think Palestinians can be tremendously optimistic about if they're bold enough, their leadership is bold enough, and willing enough to take steps in that direction.
Thanks, Youssef. Maryam, the issue of the role of the Arab states in normalization and Arab solidarity has come up already. What do you think that the Arab normalization deals with Israel mean for the Palestinians? Are these kind of one-offs, or is this a bigger trend? Has the Arab world abandoned the Palestinians for all intents and purposes? And is it possible to build a transnational solidarity movement, for example, in places like Europe and North America, without that bedrock of Arab solidarity?
Thank you, Khaled, and thank you, Youssef and Dana. So there's this rhetoric about Arab normalization framed as an abandonment of Palestinians. And I think we really need to twist that to showcase what it is. And it is a proactive collusion with Israel and with oppressive powers against Palestinians. It's not simply just walking away. And it's the same process that we have dealt with the U.S., with the international community, where I think Palestinians would be a lot better if we are actually being abandoned. But we're actually being proactively pushed into a corner by the Arab regimes around, from the Gulf to Egypt to, there's too many to name. So we really need to bring that up and emphasize it, because saying they abandoned it alleviates them from accountability. But what I think it means for Palestinians is it further pushes us into this state of isolation. And this is something that Israel has capitalized on for decades. It's the divide and conquer. It's the isolating you from the world. It's the blackout so you don't have access to speak. And what this shows is that Palestinians are increasingly being told to deal with their own problem, but at the same time, all their tools are being taken from them. In terms of Arab normalization, this isn't new. This is not a trend. We saw it in 1967. We saw it in 1948. We saw it in Oslo, where our own leadership normalized with Israel and it acquiesced a lot of Palestinian rights. And every time this has happened, it shows more about the state of the regime. So the PA was in a corner in 1991, 93 with the Madrid conference, with Oslo II. Right now, the Arab world, our biggest problem with the Arab regimes and normalization isn't the fact that it's signing on with Israel for trade and economy. The bigger problem is its own oppression in their own states. If a state cannot be just with its own people, there was no expectation for them to be just with us. So I really think we need to unpack all of this and also move beyond Palestinian exceptionalism if we really want to contribute to a discourse that addresses the international community, that addresses transnational solidarity. And this is something that keeps coming up in the way we frame things, which brings me to the concept of transnational solidarity. There's a differentiation between the government and the regimes and then the actual people. So when Bahrain signed on, when the UAE signed on, I actually had people from Bahrain, people from the Emirates, UAE, come to me and speak, this doesn't represent us. And it's just like the Palestinians saying the PA does not represent us or Hamas doesn't represent us. And we should afford that to others as well, because if we want to hold, the masses accountable as well, we need to differentiate between that. And in regards to solidarity in places like North America or Europe, I don't think it hinges on Arab solidarity. And if anyone comes and says, well, why should we show solidarity? Your own community isn't, then they're not willing to give solidarity in the first place. So I don't think this is dependent on that. And of course, we've seen in history from other cases, Algeria for one, where, solidarity from the Arab world wasn't the make or break moment. On the contrary, it came from other places. So to say that maybe the international community, namely the West, isn't going to show solidarity because of our Arab neighbors is misleading. And then we have to remember also that in the Arab world, most of the people have been fighting their own oppressive regimes, the dictators, the repression, very violent repression. And it would also be a little unfair to place that, well, you have to also support Palestinians right now on them. And I think we need to be fair about that. In regards to the solidarity that comes from places like Europe or the States or Canada, there's a little difference in that, because it's proactively contributing to the emboldenment of Israel. It is proactively contributing to building a narrative that revolves around conflict. And we have been saying this for decades. Conflict insinuates two equal sides fighting. And that's what needs to change. That's the solidarity we're looking for in the international community, namely the West. We're searching for awareness. We're searching for being self-reflective. We are searching for being critical of your own self and your own community and their own colonial histories. For the Arab world, it's slightly different. It's asking them, don't come visit Israel under BDS guidelines, for instance. And we need to differentiate between the different parts of the world, from the Arab world to Europe, to the US, to Latin America, and what each has a role in. So to clump it all together, I think has consistently led people to think, well, what can I do? And just throw their hands in the air. So we need to really bring about a contextualization of things. And I think transnational solidarity is happening. It's very much happening. It is happening in the U.S. with the Black rebellion that is happening against white supremacy and a system that has actively put people down and took opportunities from them and concealed a colonial past, to places in Europe where there are the masses that are really challenging their own policies, their own social structure, their own racism towards the refugees, towards immigrants. And I think it's slowly forging these alignments to what Yusuf was just saying, equality, self-determination, freedom. And that's how solidarity is forged.
Thank you, Mariam. If I could just stay with you for a little bit to dig a little bit deeper, what should the role be of the international community with regard to Palestine, and what can Palestinian civil society and or political leadership do to promote that role? And so I want to go kind of beyond the theoretical or the sentimental in terms of solidarity and good feelings, and focus on kind of the nuts and bolts of politics and diplomacy. What can concretely be achieved on the international level beyond kind of grassroots mobilization?
Well, I don't think you can separate grassroots mobilization from policy and diplomacy. But in terms of the international community, it really needs to be aware on their governments and their policy, basically importing Israeli policy. And we've seen it with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Israel has criminalized it on a legal level here, where you can be imprisoned for it. And we've seen it happening in the US and now Europe and the UK, where there's an actual promotion of policy that withdraws the right to not be complicit in an oppression. And it's being framed under, of course, legal terms, diplomatic terms that are misleading and make it seem like, well, this is the right of the state. No, this is a clear importing of Israeli policies against Palestinians and being employed on other masses for the purpose of vilifying Palestinians. So I think the role of the international community is to really confront the adoption of new policy that revolves around emboldening Israel, allowing it to continue its oppression, because beyond Israel, it's going to allow the oppression in other places. So I really think Americans really need to, not just Americans, and I focus on Americans now because I think the US is the primary culprit in emboldening Israel, but they need to focus on the types of social policies that are coming out in the US, especially as we've seen under the Trump administration in terms of what's happening here in Palestine. How Palestinian civil society can promote this? We forget that 50% of the Palestinian population is in diaspora. This is something that no one really speaks about. Half of the Palestinians are not in Palestine. And in order to be able to come, even on visiting rights, you have to go through Israel. So I think what Palestinians can do is reconnect with each other. There's a huge disconnect in terms of the reality here, living here, and Palestinians in diaspora. And if we are speaking about a national strategy and we're going to exclude half of the population, then we're not really speaking about a national strategy. So there needs to be a regrouping in that regards. And more than this is the international community, any president, any new leader needs to stop looking at Palestine and solving the Palestinian question as a way to push their image forward as a peace broker or someone that solved one of, the greatest problems in current history because it's always in the media. There needs to be a shift in terms of how this is approached as a duty towards the justice that they speak about, the abstract terms of democracy. We need to stop vilifying Palestinian divisions. We speak about Hamas and Fatah, and yet we glamorize this. And for us in the international community, it's an emblem of democracy. So it's being critical of the policies domestically and how they impact transnationally for everyone in the international community. I think this isn't just for the US.
Thank you, Mariam. Dana, I want to turn to you. And we've seen a number of instances in recent Palestinian history in which, we've seen these ad hoc kind of spontaneous mobilizations around Al-Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem or the March of Return in Gaza. Both, sometimes manifesting in violence, but very often kind of centered around civil disobedience and nonviolence. Obviously, there's a history of a nonviolent movement in Palestine. Why do you think it hasn't kind of taken off or gained traction? And, if something erupts, people are waiting for this, third intifada at some point. Is it likely to be violent or non-violent? And, where do Palestinians stand on this? I know you have a paper coming out with some polling data. What does the data show about the prominence of non-violence as a tactic in Palestinian liberation?
Yeah, and I was wondering if I could, before I answer that question, could I just comment on what Mariam has so eloquently stated? Sure. Just like a 2-minute thing, or
Please.
maybe less. Okay. I just wanted to say, I just want to second what she said and really emphasize the fact that, there has been historically, time and time again, Arab solidarity from citizens. Regimes have come and gone. Regimes have at times supported and at times reneged, but Arab solidarity has always been there. Bahr al-Baqar and Sina and even Bahraini soldiers in 1948. So I just want to really stress on what Mariam said and emphasize that the issue here is with Arab regimes and that there is solidarity to be built with Arab citizens. And we know this because the polls show this. Recent polling regarding diplomatic recognition of Israel across 13 countries through the Arab Opinion Index show that the highest rate of acceptance of these kinds of diplomatic deals is 13%. And it's in a country that already has a normalization deal, which is Egypt. And 13% is, clearly the vast majority is against these kinds of deals. And what we need to understand is, from my perspective, is that the systems that deny Palestinians self-determination are the same systems that prop up authoritarian regimes across the region. And the normalization deals are just a symptom of this lack of democratic accountability that these countries have. And Israel plays a key role in propping up authoritarian regimes in the region today. This is maybe a crucial reason that they've been normalizing under the table for years, this exchange of authoritarian know-how and technology. And this is why they want to go open with these relationships so that they can kind of stop paying attention to the laws that they used to have on their books, for example, in Bahrain and the UAE, that have kept them constrained from fully normalizing with Israel. So with these normalization deals, they're able to, increase this level of authoritarian coordination, tenfold. So we really need to think of it that way, that the fight for democracy, the fight against authoritarianism in the region, I think is part and parcel of fighting the continued oppression of Palestinians. Because all we need to think about is what would happen if these countries were democratic, if people got a say in the foreign policies of their governments. Israel would be held accountable in ways that it has not been. So I just wanted to, emphasize my agreement with what Mariam said and add to it just a little bit. Now, in terms of your original question, sorry for going off a little bit off topic, but about nonviolent strategies and their prevalence. So what we know is that nonviolent strategies, to be effective, require a high level of kind of social buy-in. So to be successful, to make it costly to repress these nonviolent movements, we need a lot of people to be involved. And why would a lot of people get involved? A couple of reasons. They have a shared sense of what their objectives are. They have strong social ties that kind of can push people to participating. They have organizing tools and resources that are needed to coordinate a large group of people. And Palestinians have had this in the past. In the first Intifada, the unified national leadership of the uprising not only encompassed the major political factions and coordinated their actions effectively, but a critical mass of Palestinians engaged with these actions and participated. And in my work, I tie this to the high level of social cohesion at the time. The fact that Palestinians had a general understanding and agreement on what they wanted. They had strong social ties and meaningful community organizations that acted as organizing vehicles for this kind of mobilization. But today, this is not the case, and it's not the case for a couple of reasons. So first, the physical nature of how the territories have been divided means people are more separated from each other, and lived experience can sometimes be quite different across communities in the territories. And second is the impact of the Palestinian Authority itself. As this authority has been constructed and intended to fulfill a state building project, further and further divided from the realities of that state building project and its impact on Palestinian society. And then after 2006, further divided from Palestinian society as mechanisms of democratic accountability all but broke down, all supported, of course, by the United States and the international community. And this has had a profound impact on social cohesion in Palestinian society. A sizable segment of the Palestinian population works for the Palestinian Authority, is beholden to the Palestinian Authority's project and durability for their own livelihoods. And a sizable segment is more in debt. It's struggling to survive in the environment of occupation and increased Israeli violations and a stagnant economy. And the PA has exacerbated divisions within society, especially after 2006. I would argue that social cohesion in the territories has been decimated, and Palestinian society is quite polarized. So with that kind of in mind, given the low levels of social cohesion which exist in Palestine today, this makes nonviolent movements, I think, much less likely, or the most successful forms of nonviolent mobilization that we are seeing today are, like you were talking about, highly localized with very short-term goals. So when they put cameras in the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, people had a very short-term goal. They wanted to remove the cameras. They were able to mobilize in a particular space. But nonviolent strategy with kind of long-term objectives, addressing large structural issues of concern, these are almost non-existent. So in recent polling I conducted in the territories regarding this question of support for nonviolent movements versus violent strategies, Palestinian society is quite divided. Around 43% of the West Bank and 46% of Gazan respondents support armed resistance, and around 50% in both cases support some form of nonviolent strategy. So in both parts of the territory, it's kind of, the majority support, a slim majority support forms of nonviolent strategy, but it's quite divided, and the popularity of armed resistance is increasing. And this is corroborated by polling done by the Palestinian Survey Research Center as well. And in that polling data that I collected, I also asked about perceptions of social cohesion to see if that was having an impact on how people responded. So I asked directly whether or not respondents perceived society as being cohesive or divided and polarized. And what we found was that the two groups are statistically significant differences between them. That they have significant differences in terms of how they responded. So in terms of the raw numbers, most Palestinians don't believe that society is cohesive. And again, this is kind of in line with reality. But between the two groups, those who perceive society as being more cohesive are less likely to support violent action. And given that most Palestinians don't see it that way, and therefore don't trust that if a nonviolent movement began, there would be kind of broad participation, it explains why armed resistance is kind of becoming more popular as an option, because it seems to them the only strategic option. But I have a few other results, but I think that's kind of the main takeaway from that recent research.
Thank you, Dana. Yusuf, I want to turn to you and maybe ask you to unpack a little bit of what we heard. Just given the reality that we heard from Dana and Mariam and that we've discussed here, Palestinian division, the lack of buy-in in these sort of mass mobilization movements, lack of confidence in their leadership. Clearly, I mean, it seems to me anyway, that politics is somehow essential. That you need political leadership, you need political leaders who can have and articulate and pursue a national strategy. How do we get there? And what should be the address for, what is the primary political vehicle for Palestinians? Is it the Palestinian Authority, or is that now obsolete? Is it the PLO umbrella and its historic role that it's played? Or is it something new? Because I don't see how we can go from where we are now to any vision without a cohesive polity, if not an actual coherent leadership. So how do Palestinians get there?
Yeah, thanks, Khaled. If I could just pull a Dana and respond to the point that Miriam was raising earlier, and then get to that. I think it's really important to emphasize on this question of normalization and Arab solidarity. You know, the context in which we are seeing a lot of these numbers that Dana mentioned in the public opinion polling of Arab publics, which are really striking in terms of how many people in the Arab world continue to oppose their governments normalizing with Israel. And the important context is this. It is the Palestinian leadership that has been leading and normalizing with Israel in the last 30 years. We have this week a Palestinian leadership that has decided to scurry back to security coordination with the Israelis, not just in opposition to where Palestinian public opinion is, but also their own decision-making institutions that have decided against this measure and have still been overruled by the top of the leadership. So, you know, when you consider the extent to which, what is named the Palestinian leadership has been leading the way in normalizing with Israel, what more can we expect from Arab publics in terms of their solidarity when their views are as consolidated as they are? And I would say there is this analysis that says, well, you know, this normalization is starting to happen because Palestine is no longer as resonant in the region as it used to be. And I think it's actually the inverse that is true. I think the reason that this normalization is happening is precisely because Palestine continues to be resonant. Maybe not in exactly the same ways as it was, and it's not as important for the same reasons as it used to be. But I think it's important for people to understand that the regimes that are moving in the direction of normalization are first and foremost concerned about their own survival and about threats that are coming internally from the prospect of democratization and liberalization and their own publics achieving political power. And the prospect of freedom and self-determination for Palestine, particularly in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, is something that would send shockwaves throughout the region more, I think, than anything we saw in Tahrir Square or in Tunisia or anywhere else. And so I think this is the main issue today behind these normalization pushes is the fear of Arabs claiming the franchise and their own rights within their own countries. And that's because Palestine continues to be a very resonant issue. On your question, what structure does, you know, reformed representation take? I'm not really sure. I know it doesn't look like the Palestinian Authority, that's for sure. I think it looks, you know, something between what was the PLO and something new. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but it's very clear that any sort of institution that has become as tainted as the Palestinian Authority has become and as unrepresentative as it has become, sadly, is not in a position to reclaim that mantle. In some ways, perhaps one of the blessings the Palestinian Authority has left for the PLO is that it has left us with a memory of a different institution, as problematic and as corrupt as it was, still looks much better in comparison to what the Palestinian Authority is today when it comes to legitimacy and representation. So I don't think a PLO structure just revigorating that is going to be enough. I think there's plenty of work to still be done, but it looks like something between that and something new that brings in all stakeholders in ways that we have not seen before.
Thank you. Maryam, did you have your hand? Did you want to respond? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, I did. So I'll be kind of building on both Dana and Yusuf. I really want to go back to the talk on armed resistance and nonviolence. And I think we also need to remember that in order to speak about nonviolence, we must speak about all the other factors that are contributing to our inability to work through nonviolence. That means when we go to places like the UN and the US so graciously pulls out the veto card, where we can't even engage on the diplomatic level, the struggle that it took, the PA to become an observer state, just the barriers that are placed in front of Palestinians on a diplomatic level makes it unfair to suggest any other option than armed resistance. And then you have administrations like the Trump administration cutting off US aid, which in effect, the beneficiaries of US aid are refugees, the most vulnerable of the Palestinian community. So when you're shrinking resources, when you're further closing down the avenues of nonviolence, which nonviolence means also diplomatic sector. When you do that, you leave no option except armed resistance. For Palestinians on a civil society level, when you constantly see the international community betraying your nonviolent attempts, and this includes the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, when the constant vilification of nonviolence is there, then you're going to say, well, fine, okay, then we'll do armed resistance. And we must remember that armed resistance is enshrined under international law. And then this brings me to the national strategy framework and who really represents the Palestinians. So the Palestinian Authority cannot represent the Palestinians. Not only is it, I don't think it's unfit on a political level, it's unfit on the fact that it doesn't really have any resources which give it equal opportunity to engage in things like negotiation, but it's willing to beat up Palestinian protesters in the street when they come out against their coordination with Israel against Gaza. The PA has actively coordinated with Israel to hold sanctions on Gaza. So of course it's not representative. But I think the getting caught up in this debate of who represents the Palestinian people is also a problem. In terms of national strategy, Palestinians will build their national strategy when liberation comes. Right now, all our national strategies here, upon implementation, are created by European representatives because we're dependent on aid. So I think we need to move away from that and start speaking about what's the strategy to achieve the basic demands for Palestinians. And what are the basic demands of Palestinians? We keep speaking about, the sensational approach that we have in our discourse, liberation, justice, equality, but that's what underpins it. And if we want to speak about, okay, what are the demands of Palestinians? And if it really is that confusing, I think there's enough UN resolution, there's enough documents that outline what are the basic needs of Palestinians on a policy level, on an accountability level, and on a structure and framework level. So if we want to speak about Palestinians and blame them for the lack of a national strategy or trying to create alternatives, we need to also remember that during the first Intifada, one of the biggest lessons was that on a community level, we are able to coordinate and we are able to strategize in a way that is efficient and effective to meet the needs of the Palestinian community. Sure, it doesn't fall within the framework of American governance or European governance, but it works. It works for Palestinians. And I think that's what's going to matter in the end. So it's aiding the Palestinians on achieving what has already been designated as unjust by these very states that keep saying, well, you should be nonviolent. Khaled, you're on mute.
Yeah, it has to happen at least once in every Zoom. Based on what we just heard from Maryam, that the PA is not representative, and for that matter, the PLO, you could make a similar case. The PLO is no longer really truly representative. The question in my mind is, so should the focus, it's a question of sequence. Should the focus be first reform the political institutions, bodies, alleged representatives, and then pursue a national strategy, or is it the other way around and somehow civil society will mobilize in such a way that will force the leadership to kind of well, first end the division and then reform itself and to pursue the strategy that is coming from below. So how what is the first step in your view in Palestinian liberation? Is it first replace your leadership and then pursue a national strategy, or the other way around?
Dana, go ahead.
I was going to ask who he was talking to.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I meant for you, Dana.
Oh, for me. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, Maryam, please feel free to jump in at any time. Yeah. So in terms of like sequencing, I mean, I think that, I don't have all the answers on this one, but I have in the past advocated for reforming the Palestine Liberation Organization because in spite of its shortcomings, it is an organization with dealing with a lot of pressure at the time and certain personalities and all of these things. It was still an amazing accomplishment for the Palestinian people to get all of these Palestinians, all of these people who had become refugees, and represent them in some way and mobilize them and actually pose a threat to the Israeli continued displacement. Sorry, the Israeli policy of continued Palestinian displacement. So, that aside, I don't think that we should completely ignore the Palestine Liberation Organization or not consider it as like some meaningful form of organizing in the future. I just think it does need to be reformed, and I've advocated for not only making kind of revitalizing its internal institutions, possibly holding elections, things like this, but incorporating larger swaths of Palestinian society as it used to in the past. And we have the technology today, unlike in the past, to incorporate Palestinians in the diaspora. So there are all of these e-democracy initiatives that have been used in different countries. We can do the same. I have no doubt in the ingenuity of the Palestinian people and their technical know-how to be able to kind of revitalize the PLO in certain ways. So from the top down, yes, we need new leadership, and the Palestinian Authority should become, put back in its place as kind of a subsidiary of the PLO rather than what is driving the conversation. But also bottom up pressure doesn't, has also a role to play, and it doesn't need to be discounted. It's just I also I sometimes am concerned. I'm a little bit worried about putting too much on people who, like Maryam said, have lost a lot of their resources. Civil society in Palestine has become kind of driven by foreign funding motives. There's a lot of that. So we need to empower some of the grassroots initiatives more, find ways to empower kind of the non-traditional forms of civil society, because some of the kind of more long-standing organizations have have stopped playing a very useful role. But at the same time, I think, both things can happen at the same time. I don't know that I have a clear answer about sequencing. I just think that bottom up and top down would be, both suitable strategies concurrently.
Thanks for that. Yusuf, I wanted to take things in a slightly different direction and talk a little bit about the United States. Obviously, we have a new administration that's coming in. I think we all have a pretty good view of where they stand and have stood on the issue of Palestine and Israel. And I know that you're not a huge fan of the US-led peace process. You're a critic, as am I, and many others, of the role that the US has played. But obviously, the United States is a power that Palestinians can't ignore. What should the relationship be between a Palestinian leadership and an incoming Biden administration, that is different from the current one that is very much one of clientelism and sponsorship and almost infantilization of Palestinians? What should the proper role be, given the limitations that we know exist in American politics and that the Biden administration is not going to support a one-state solution? What would you advise the leadership to do that it isn't doing now?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're certainly right that Palestinians cannot afford to ignore Washington. I don't think many countries or peoples around the world can, let alone those in the positions that Palestinians are in. But I think that, for both from the Palestinian perspective towards Washington and Washington's perspective towards Israel-Palestine, what I would hope the path that they take is that at least is reasonably plausible, is one of do no harm or do less harm. I think that, the reality is that the politics are simply not in place yet here in the United States for a presidential administration to really make a difference on Israel-Palestine on their own. That foundation continues to need to be laid, and I think it is being built, but there's still plenty of work to be done then. In the interim, what can be done, or at least what should no longer be done? I think, from the Palestinian side, they're going to look at this opportunity as an opportunity to breathe a little bit after 4 years of an increasingly tightening restrictions around Palestinians in every possible way because of Trump administration policies founded in absolute cruelty and hatred towards Palestinians, from everything towards cutting off funding to the Palestinian Authority to cutting off funding to international agencies which serve the most vulnerable Palestinians like UNRWA and so on. And so this, I think from the Palestinian perspective, is going to be looked at as an opportunity to catch their breath a little bit after an extremely difficult 4 years, but it should not come, I hope, at the expense of returning to the failed protocols of the past. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the past week or so, in some of the decisions made by the Palestinian Authority leadership, suggests that that's not going to be the case. Actually, that they are going to try to revert to the past protocols and think that there's some strategic value in that. We see that with the immediate return to security coordination. We see that with the return of ambassadors to Arab countries, as if they didn't just finish saying that these represent a stab in the back to Palestinians, a couple months ago. I think that will do active harm to Palestinians in the short and long term by returning to that. And from Washington's end, I don't think a Biden administration is going to do a whole lot on this issue. They're going to look for the least that they can do. There's not much that they want to do. And I think, the best that they can do that is plausible right now is to think about ways to roll back not just some of the harm of the Trump administration, but ways they can roll back some of the active harm that the United States has been doing to Palestinians in the Obama administration, and the Bush administration, and the Clinton administration, and historically by thinking about ways to advance accountability measures for Israeli violations in American policy. I think there is space to start thinking about that in this administration. The bandwidth is going to be very, very, very low. You have a pandemic here in the United States that's not gone away. It's only getting worse. An economic crisis that is not going away, and an international agenda that is going to be dominated by a whole different set of issues in which Palestine is an extremely minor part from Washington's perspective. So I think, you know, the approach of try to do the least harm possible from both sides is the most, in terms of a bilateral relationship at the top levels, that one can expect. But there's much more to the relationship than just the top levels. And that's where I think Palestinians have the greatest prospect to create gains during these next 4 years by building relationships with institutions and policymakers and opinion shapers in the United States, at the civil society level and at some government official levels as well, to build the kind of foundation that will in the future allow a presidential election to make a difference in Israel-Palestine policy.
Thanks, Yusuf. I want to piggyback on that, and actually, we have a question from the audience directed at either Maryam or Dana, and of course, any three of you, or the three of you, are welcome to respond. Why haven't we seen, after 72 years, why haven't we seen an effective Palestinian lobby here in the United States? After all this time, maybe not something on the scale of AIPAC, but perhaps something more on the level of a J Street, at least. Why has that not happened?
I can start off if, yeah. I think 72 years is actually a short time in terms of getting engaged in American policy and diplomacy. It's a very, very reserved space that I think comes entwined with race. I think it comes entwined with class and gender and all of these dynamics that make it very difficult to enter that space. As we just see from the state of affairs in the US right now, I think the Israeli lobby is also weaker than we like to believe. The Israeli lobby functions on a lot of bullying, a lot of exploiting political dynamics domestically in order to influence international interventions. And Palestinians don't have that ability either. And I don't think we should ever resort to that sort of kind of engagement on the US policy level. Instead, that shouldn't be our metric, is basically what I'm trying to say, because if that's our metric, then also the way Israel is going to be our metric for our national strategy. And that will completely erase any Palestinian efforts at achieving our own liberation and our own kind of idea of how we want to function as a people, as a population, and as a state.
Great, thank you. If anyone wants to tackle that same question, but let me add to it and pose this question to, I'll direct it at Dana, just so that we're going in order, but anyone can answer this. What about the role of international forums and mechanisms for accountability, the kind of accountability that Yusuf talked about, like the International Criminal Court? We've seen the Palestinian leadership has taken some steps, but obviously they're very reserved in moving, too aggressively toward something like that, which both the United States and Israel are likely to respond and have responded very hostily. Is that something that can be taken advantage of? And are there other international initiatives that or international bodies or forums that can be pursued given the current state of Palestinian politics?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of an echo, I think. Can everybody hear me properly?
Yeah, we.
Okay, so in terms of the original question regarding why don't we have a lobby and all of these things, I mean, what Mariam said is true. It's tied up with race and class and these kinds of things, but also, Israel is separately from its role in the region towards Palestinians and towards Arabs, it is a crucial part of American strategy and American hegemony and power projection. So it only makes sense that there is space for lobbying and space for Israeli input and American decision making, because their policies and their objectives align in terms of controlling this very strategic part of the world. In terms of the international mechanisms that we could pursue, this is a little bit outside my scope of expertise. I'm less aware of kind of the international organizations and their efficacy. But from my understanding, especially given how Israel has responded to some of these attempts, that course of action has been quite effective. Pursuing Israel in the ICC and things like that has been quite effective, but I don't think that it can be the main strategy by any means. I don't think that it could be the sole way that we try to pressure Israel on the ground. Because at the end of the day, much of these systems, and I think personally, especially after 2003, have eroded, they rely on certain countries upholding the decision making and the impact of these decisions, but those countries are quite missing from the international stage, especially after the invasion of Iraq. So that's kind of my off-the-cuff assessment, but again, it's not fully within my area of expertise.
Thanks, Dana. Yusuf, you're welcome to respond to anything that that either Mariam or Dana have already mentioned. But I wanted to bring up the issue of BDS, which I know you're obviously familiar with. The BDS movement has had many successes, but it's also under siege. Historically, the BDS movement has sort of shied away from taking political or ideological stances. They've been mostly agnostic on issues like one state versus two states, at least officially. But given the success of the BDS movement, actually, one of the things that I find very interesting is the response by Israel to BDS and now also by Congress and others in the US to the BDS movement is very similar to the response that they had to the PLO in the 1970s and 80s and to Hamas in the 1990s and the 2000s, where there was real, this massive assault and attempt to delegitimize at every level. The odd thing being, of course, that BDS doesn't use violence in the way that both Hamas and the PLO historically have, and yet it's elicited this same sort of almost hysterical response. With that in mind, in a lot of ways, the BDS is already kind of playing a political role. So given the political vacuum on the Palestinian side, is it time now maybe to expand BDS's mandate and to make it more overtly political, to use it as a vehicle for propelling the Palestinian struggle forward? Or is that simply beyond the pale for a movement like BDS? An admittedly provocative question.
Yeah, no, and a fine question. I think, look, I think what I would push back on is some of the characterization here. The movement, although I think it's a misnomer and a Unfortunately, I think that the boycott national committee has sort of played into this becoming a misnomer. But the movement is not for BDS. It's not a BDS movement, even though that's what it is often called. BDS is a set of tactics, and it is a movement for Palestinian rights. And this is a set of tactics that Palestinian civil society actors who are already engaged in the conversation about internal representation within Palestinian society have made to international actors in a call for international solidarity in standing with them. So these are two, I think, importantly separate things, and it's important that they be kept separate things precisely for those reasons. I think one of the reasons why the BDS call has been as successful as it has been is because one, it reaches out to international actors and it keeps Palestinians united on the broadest set of common denominators. And sidestepping these, one state, two state, whatever questions is precisely what allows it to do that. The Palestinian future is one that is to be determined by Palestinians. And that is something that should be kept separate from international solidarity with Palestinians, which should really be about, international actors looking at their own complicity in the violation of Palestinian rights. And God knows that there's plenty of work to be done on that front as Palestinians continue to figure out the future vision that makes most sense for them.
Thanks, Yusuf. So we're just about out of time, but before we close, I'd like to give you each an opportunity to make any closing remarks. If you can do it in 30 to 60 seconds would be fantastic. But let's just go around. We'll start with Maryam.
Thank you, Khaled. I think as a final remark, we really need to stop asking the Palestinians to play within the system of diplomacy and politics that has done nothing but oppress and put the odds against Palestinians and Americans and Europeans and otherwise, and start thinking of ways where you can shake up that system and its policies and reflect on them. And I think the U.S. is making headway in that regards, but to stop asking the Palestinians to play within that system and then blaming them for playing wrong, and start asking what's wrong with our politics and our diplomacy.
Thanks, Maryam. Dana or Yusuf, either of you can go next.
I guess I could go because I unmuted myself already. I would just say, my takeaway from all of this is that I don't think that we can discount Arab solidarity. I think that that is a avenue that Palestinians should pursue. There are civil society organizations that are doing really important and radical and pressing work, and we don't need to remain isolated. We should reach out, and we should continue to forge ties with people in the region that are not fighting on our behalf, but also fighting for themselves, and not equate what happens at the regime level with how people feel. I think that that's been a huge mistake that I've seen Palestinians commit. And then the second thing is we also need to kind of put our own house in order in terms of getting a clear objective for what we want from our allies and from what we want from Arab civil society in other countries. I think part of that is that our own confusion about how we want them to behave and how we want them to show solidarity. So more questions perhaps than answers, but that's kind of my closing sentiment.
Thank you. Yusuf, you'll have the last word.
Thanks, Khaled, and thanks again for putting this all together. I think for a number of decades now, Palestinian leaders have looked at the massive power imbalance between our stateless people and the Israelis and their backers, and determined that that is a fundamentally insurmountable balance, and have decided to modify their goals instead of modify their strategy to overcome that. I think that in the process of doing so, they have overlooked a tremendous source of power, which is within their own people, within the Palestinian people. And I think that before we can begin thinking about how we affect things externally in terms of with the Arab world or with Washington or anything else, we must find a way to be strong internally as a people, across divides, across institutions. And then I think we can tap into the very thing that those Arab publics are responding to, which is not the Palestinian leadership, but the just nature of the Palestinian cause, which has a resonance not just in the Arab world, but internationally, precisely in the places where we need to see the most change.
Thank you, Youssef, and thank you all. I'm thrilled with the richness of this discussion. So thank you, Mariam Barghouti and Dana Al-Kurd, Youssef Munayir, for making this a really fascinating discussion. Hopefully this will be the first of many such conversations. I know we've only scratched the surface. And thank you all to those of you who've joined part 2 and part 1. A recording of this session and Tuesday's session will be up on our website immediately after today. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you again soon.